Hi there, my name is Alison. I'm an occupational therapy student at the Down Syndrome Resource Foundation, and today I'm going to be talking to you about stimming. So today's focus is going to be on understanding and responding to stimming. We're going to focus on explaining stimming behaviors, understanding sensory processing and self-regulation and how this affects stimming, as well as hear some perspectives from people who stim and identify challenges of stimming. We're also going to discuss how to respond to stimming and learn some strategies for self-regulation and sensory processing. But first, I'd like you to take a moment to think about some of the stimming that you may do. Do you bite your nails, chew on a straw, twirl your hair around your finger, or move your leg back and forth when sitting? You may do all of this without even realizing that you're doing it. We often don't notice how our different senses are working together to balance and regulate us throughout the day. For others, it's harder to make those sensory systems balance naturally, so they create more sensations for themselves. And that's what looks like stimming. So I encourage you to pause this video and do the stimming movements or sounds that your child does. See how it feels for yourself. Now, do you feel more alert, more calm, maybe more focused? Stimming or self-stimulatory behaviors involve repetitive movements or sounds. Stimming can look different for different people. Some examples of stimming behaviors are hand flapping, body rocking, humming, smelling objects or other people, repeating words or phrases, maybe tapping ears or objects, turning lights on and off, dangling objects in front of the eyes, licking hands or toys, maybe making throat clearing noises, spinning, and lots more. Stimming allows the individual to better handle situations with overwhelming sensory input, like being in a room that's too cold or too noisy. Stimming can result from either a positive emotion, like being happy or excited, or a more negative emotion, like being anxious or distressed. And although stimming behavior may look the same, it can be due to different emotional states. Stimming acts as a self-regulation mechanism to help manage excitement and relieve anxiety, anger, or fear. Research has also found that individuals with disabilities that affect their sensory systems, like Down syndrome or autism spectrum disorder, have sensory processing symptoms more so than developing children, which explains why it's more common to see stimming behavior from people with disabilities. It's also important to consider that what looks like stimming might be a symptom of a medical issue, such as seizures or having an earache or a toothache. So it's important to also consult your doctor. Stimming can also be explained as meeting one of the four functions of behavior, meaning the reasons that people do any behavior. The four functions of behavior involve gaining attention, gaining access to preferred items, escaping something undesirable, or sensory stimulation, meaning that the behavior feels good and that's a reason to do it, like what we see with stimming. So to understand stimming more, we also need to understand sensory processing. Sensory processing refers to the way that the body receives, analyzes, and responds to signals it receives from the environment. So there are 8 sensory systems. There's the auditory system, which is the sounds you hear, tactile, which is touch, your visual system, olfactory, which is smell, gustatory, which is taste, your vestibular sense, which is your sense of movement in space, proprioceptive, which is your sensations from muscles and joints of the body, as well as your body awareness. And there's also interoception, which is the sense of the internal state of the body, such as feeling hungry or recognizing the need to pee. So self-regulation occurs when all of the sensory systems of the body are balanced. So why can it be harder for some people to self-regulate? So first, we're going to look at 4 sensory profiles. There's the sensory seeking profile, which is where someone enjoys and seeks an increased amount of sensory input. There's also the sensory sensitive profile, where they might have a heightened awareness of what's going on in the environment. There's also the low registration profile, which is where they require a higher amount of input to register it. So they may take longer to miss or not respond to any sensory input. And then there's also sensory avoidant, which is where someone copes by avoiding certain sensory input. And then after looking at the profiles, we also need to consider what the person's personal threshold is for certain sensory stimuli. So if you have a high threshold, that means that you need more frequency or intensity of a sensation to register it. And if you have a low threshold, you might feel the sensation quickly or may miss or need increased sensory input. So an individual's sensory profile and their threshold for sensory input will impact their ability to self-regulate. So if a person's stimming, they're providing themselves the input they need to regulate their sensory system. People who stim have reported in research that stimming can be a useful coping mechanism to process dynamic and unpredictable sensations. It can also help with concentration and learning. It can be useful to contain or control excess emotions. It can be helpful when learning to recognize inner emotional states. And it can also be calming or soothing for overwhelming sensations or emotions. But there's also some challenges of stimming. Stimming can be disruptive, it can be distracting for you or your child, it can decrease their ability to learn or maybe increase social isolation. It can also be confusing or alarming for others. It can cause physical harm to the child or to others. Research has also found that stimming could be misinterpreted as aggressive, and negative responses from others can also impact performance and mental health. And it can also increase discrimination and marginalization. So thinking about all of this, is stimming bad? No. Instead, I encourage you to shift your way of thinking about stimming to how can I support someone's sensory needs and self-regulation ability and make the stimming more functional so that they don't need to stim in a distracting or harmful way. So when we begin to look at some stimming strategies, it's helpful to think of the goal as not to reduce stimming, but to improve the child's quality of life. So let's look at how to respond to stimming. First, we need to be sensory detectives. We need to identify individual sensory profile and corresponding thresholds for input so you can better understand the person's sensory needs. So you can speak with an occupational therapist to do this by administering a sensory profile assessment for a comprehensive understanding of sensory processing, or you can also use your own tracking sheet to notice patterns, including what the trigger is, what the stimming behavior is, as well as sensory input they are seeking and avoiding throughout the day, and also in different situations or environments. Then you can adapt the environment to adjust to the needs to avoid the triggers for stimming. So this will need to be specific to the individual's needs. For example, some individuals may stim more in a loud environment and need quiet, and some people may stim less if there's calming music on. So next, consider adapting the activities the person is stimming during. So if you notice a pattern of stimming with the same toys, for example, they're banging the toys together, teach a functional way to play with the toys. So for example, if they like visual stimming, you can teach them to build a tower and then watch as it falls down. As well, you could also adapt the toys so that they meet the sensory need. So for example, using light up blocks if they're sensory seeking. And then we also want to think about implementing a sensory diet. So the term sensory diet is basically a daily activity plan that is specifically designed for the individual to meet their sensory needs. So think of a sensory diet as having a main course, which are activities that are powerful and satisfying, such as movement, deep pressure touch, and heavy work. And then you also have lighter snack activities throughout the day. So these are beneficial, but they last for a shorter period of time, such as oral, auditory, visual, and smell experiences. So for example, if someone likes to stim by jumping, providing them with several opportunities for jumping and movement throughout the day will help them self-regulate so that they don't need to stim because they've already met that need. And sensory diets should include more input than just their stimming behavior, such as jumping. The goal is to meet all of their sensory needs. So some things to consider when making a sensory diet are their sensory profile and the threshold to meet those needs, because some of the sensory stimuli will be more alerting or more calming for other people. So think of the goal as to create a sensory diet that keeps the person balanced and regulated throughout the day to reduce stimming. So my biggest takeaway for you is not to stop someone from stimming, whether physically or telling them to stop, because it's taking away their ability to self-regulate. So if you simply tell them to stop, it won't likely reduce the stimming behavior, and instead they might develop new stims or it might make the behavior harder to redirect. So instead, focus on providing opportunities to meet sensory needs throughout the day and adjusting activities or environments to accommodate those needs. And then you can look at redirecting the stimming behavior in the moment. So also consider that the stimming may not need to be controlled if it's not causing harm or reducing the child's quality of life. It's important to remember that not all people have voluntary control over their stimming. In a research study, participants expressed that trying to stop their stims comes at a depleting and effortful cost. And also consider that an appropriate response to stimming will depend on the situation or the trigger, as well as the person's unique sensory profile. So for someone who's spinning, they might be doing it for completely different reasons than somebody else. So when responding to stimming in the moment, first identify the possible trigger for the stimming. Are they stressed? Is the environment too loud? And remember that triggers are not always negative. Sometimes people stim when they're excited or happy. 3 of the most common triggers are needing to self-regulate, being bored, or being excited. And then address the trigger or sensory need. So if the room is too bright, you could close the blinds, turn down the lights, and I encourage you to make them part of this process. And in the moment, you can also provide a tool that meets the same sensory need. So for example, if they're stimming by humming, you can give them an oral motor chewy tool for them to bite on to replace the stimming behavior. And this will work best if the replacement tool meets the stimming need more effectively than the stimming behavior. So you may need to trial and error or speak with an occupational therapist to find out what tool will work best for each individual. And if you're not using a specific tool, you can also redirect the stimming by using an action. So if they're stimming by hand flapping, for example, when excited, you could redirect them to clap their hands or squeeze or push their hands together. And then you also want to make sure that you're increasing access to sensory tools. So if you're in a classroom, have a hand fidget like a fidget spinner or a fidget cube at their desk or clipped on their clothing or with the EA so that it's always easily accessible, and this will decrease stimming as it will increase their use of the tool. I also suggest making stimming functional. So for example, if someone is oral stimming, you could have them chew gum or eat a sour candy, as these are more functional activities to meet the same sensory need. But I also want to encourage you to have them ask for the sensory tools so that they don't learn that stimming can then get them a reward like candy. And another way to make stimming functional is to incorporate the stimming action into an activity. So if they're hand flapping when listening to a music, for example, you could encourage them to clap their hands along to the song, bang on a drum, or whatever would be encouraging for them to be a part of the activity. And if the stimming behavior is disruptive, you could set a time expectation for stimming. So for example, saying, okay, humming for 1 minute and then all done, or you can also use a visual timer. And if you are providing them with the opportunity to stim, for example, spinning, it's helpful to find a cue to ground them after stimming. So for example, saying, touch your nose, touch your arm, or it could be a physical prompt to ground them, such as using a heavy ball or a hug after stimming. And you also want to think about creating a safe environment for the person who is stimming. So remove items to stim with that could cause harm, for example, scissors, and cue them for appropriate spaces to stim, both ahead of time and in the moment, such as an open room with lots of space if they're stimming with very large movements. And if they're stimming by something such as biting their arm or scratching their skin, you could provide something like a sensory bracelet in the same spot that they're biting, so that they can then bite the bracelet or the band to redirect them instead of biting skin to reduce the harm. And then you also want to think about reinforcing acceptable behavior. So if a child is excited or bored and responding by using a sensory strategy or using language or any other acceptable behaviors, identify what they're doing and praise it. So make this connection direct by reinforcing directly after you see the acceptable behavior and being specific with what you're praising them for. So for example, you could say, I see that you're feeling bored and I like the way that you're tapping your fidget cube. And so we also just want to keep thinking about self-regulation, which is encouraging self-control rather than your control. So you might need to teach them how to ask for sensory breaks. For example, you could use a paper break card, and you could give them the break card and have them have a jumping break to start teaching them how to use the break card. And if they start stimming, remind them to use the break card and provide the opportunity for the jumping activity right away. And you want to help them identify the stimming behavior so that they can give you feedback on what they need to help meet those sensory needs. And it's also important to consider their mental health. So reducing anxiety can reduce stimming behavior, especially for individuals with Down syndrome or autism spectrum disorder. You can do this by providing routine, expectations, or using visuals, such as a visual schedule. And it's also important to help the person manage social responses to stimming. And you can do this by increasing their self-esteem, helping them understand their stimming, and manage any potential embarrassment. And you could do this by making social stories about their stimming, providing cues or scripts for what to say when someone asks about their stimming, and overall helping them to understand that their stimming is not bad and it does not make them bad. Also, you can support the individual by being an advocate to reduce the stigma of stimming by helping other people understand. So my biggest takeaways for you are to be sensory detectives, use sensory strategies throughout the day to meet the individual's needs, and to remember, don't simply stop stimming behaviors, but redirect them to something more functional. And if you have any more questions about stimming, feel free to contact an occupational therapist at the Down Syndrome Resource Foundation. And if you have any more questions, feel free to check out the references here. Thanks for watching.